Um, so thank you. Hope everybody's having a great day. And let's start with the COVID update, which, might be a thing of the past soon, right? Um, so here we go. Um, the state of emergency, it's going to end on June 15th in Massachusetts. And the governor announced there's no communities that are in the red in our state, which is unbelievable. And this is based on data from June 4th, FYI. And the virus numbers in the past week rose by 913. So that's 669 fewer viruses than the previous week. And we're at a total of 662,000 people. And that's out of about 7 million people and change in Massachusetts that live in Massachusetts. The number of people who died, still 40 people died, which was actually 6 more than the week before. And of course, that's going to depend on who gets the virus, how badly it affects them. And so it's a still continues that sad trend. And we've lost 17,458 people. And, some of those people, if we had been able to grapple with this virus quicker, could be alive today. But our state trends, as we look to the future, look hopeful as we look ahead. We'd like to see that number obviously drop to 0 deaths. This is the congregate care statistics for COVID. And I always tell you it's from the previous Wednesday, since we do this on Mondays. And again, the congregate care numbers are here that we see out of about 8,800 people. Right now, there's about 37 cases that are live, and there's been less than 5 deaths in our, congregate care system. Obviously, there's tens of thousands of people living in individual settings, and there's about 270 people living in 2 large facilities that continue to exist in Massachusetts. Since our last report, the virus activity decreased by 7. As you recall, it was actually in the 40s.
A lot of listening.
And our state facility reported less than 5 cases. And it was really a 1 state facility. But again, for people catching the virus, the larger the place, the more people that caught it. So that, we still have a 49% average for the 2 large facilities, whereas state operated and private are under 30%. You can see those numbers, 27.5%, 21.7%. Well, basically in the same ballpark in terms of catching the virus. Just in the US, what's interesting is in March, April, the numbers rose for adolescents in terms of hospital rates with COVID. And yet those 65 and over, those numbers stayed flat. And we had about 33 million people and a few more that have caught the virus overall, and 593,961 deaths. So it's been pretty formidable. And as you can see, that's Chicago last spring, the empty streets in the city of Chicago from the impact of the virus. And my hunch is those are still right, but I did not look at the state per capita rates anymore. I dropped that one. So you're looking at old ones, but as you may recall, the Dakotas used to be 1 and 2, and then Utah and Tennessee kept fighting each other. Rhode Island kept getting up there. Maybe we'll do that next week, but at some point, I'll want your feedback from people to see if we want to be doing this anymore. And then here is the daily trends in the US. You can see that monster boost in December and January and in February, and then the steep decline by March 12th. And actually before March 12th, if you look at it, it's already declining. Let me get my cursor. Where are you, cursor? Here you are. You see that deep decline before March 12th, probably end of February, maybe March 1st. And then you see that. And then it had a little uptick because people got confident, right? And a friend of ours, colleague of ours, told us one of his friends died actually after this uptick, being a little too confident. And now here you see June 3rd's, June 4th's number there. So, all right, let me, so I'm pleased today to introduce our 2 guests. I know both of them are on. I saw Jesse get on as well. And this is something our friends at CIL reached out to us, said, Leo, you really haven't, there seems to be a gulf between folks working on housing in general and the disability community. And That's probably true more recently than it was like 10 years ago, when we had pretty good, I think for a good 2 decades of my time here in the 90s and 2000s, we worked closely with CHAPA and other groups around CHAPA. So, but believe it or not, still in Connecticut, and it does obviously a lot of business in Massachusetts and elsewhere across, especially the East Coast. They introduced us to abundant housing, so it's pretty cool. Chris, let me introduce Chris first, who's Vice President of Real Estate Development at CIL. We know them historically because with the institutionalization, their activities came to the fore and helped a lot of organizations have housing to help with the deinstitutionalization effort. But they went from there to do a lot more than that. And I'm sure, both Chris and Jesse will share a few minutes about their organizations as well. But they, provide consultation to nonprofits, service providers, and municipalities. And community revitalization is now a very big part of what they do. Jesse Kanson-Benanav is the executive director of Abundant Housing, and they're based in Massachusetts, and technically might be abundant housing in Massachusetts. But it really is about abundant housing for all. And I did get a chance to check out the website. And one of their biggest points is that our housing continues to reflect segregation based on income and race. And there are their websites, which you'll get when we send you the PDFs. And I just want to touch on, before I let them loose, on some of the themes, and also our housing accessory. We have an accessory housing bill that we've been pushing for a couple of sessions. Of course, as both of you know, they're heavily fought by groups at a municipal level, and it would create housing, affordable housing, accessory for elders and people with disabilities, 2-bedroom ones. And then in terms of this discussion today, some of the themes are is the goal to create more affordable multifamily housing. Of course, also accessible housing for us. And then the issue of multifamily zoning in MBTA communities, desirable forms of zoning, the higher development costs that are forced by the present zoning rules and land use rules. They reinforce car-dependent neighborhoods. And of course, zoning, one of the themes for SIL and affordable housing, more accessory dwelling units in communities statewide, and strengthening 40B, which was a huge thing for us for years. So let me get out of the screen sharing and let.
There was a comment in the chat.
Yeah.
What does CIL stand for?
All right, Chris, you can do the honors because I don't remember, and I've called it SIL for so long. So, and let me, let's profile the speaker as we do that, Chris, and then let me show Jesse too. Jesse, say something so you'll get profiled for a second. So, but I'll see both of you for a second.
All right, here I am.
Oh, that's weird. How come it didn't get you? There you are. Okay. So that's you guys, and that's Jesse over there. Let's try it again. All right. Well, I don't know what's going on. I hit speaker, but it didn't do it. Go ahead, Chris. Why don't you talk about SIL first, and then Jesse talk about abundant housing, and then we can get right into the topic.
Okay. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Chris Canna. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate Development for CIL. And CIL stands for the Corporation for Independent Living, although we go by CIL whenever possible because Corporation for Independent Living has kind of changed over the last 40 years, so people get a little confused about the meaning sometimes. But we're a nonprofit real estate development company based in Hartford, Connecticut. We work in Connecticut and Massachusetts. We were founded 40 years ago by service providers in Connecticut, including the ARC of Connecticut, Easter Seals of Connecticut, and 4 others, to develop housing for individuals coming out of the state training schools, the state institutions in Connecticut. And that's been the bulk of the work we've done over the last 40 years is just that, partnering with service providers to develop housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, acquired brain injury, mental health conditions, etc.
Thanks, Chris. And Jesse, do you want to share a little bit about independent housing, and then we can start with the your themes?
Yeah, absolutely. You want me to just talk a little bit about who we are?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, my name is Jesse Kanson-Benanav. I'm the executive director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. We're a new statewide organization here in Massachusetts. We were founded just last year in 2020, and I'm on my 6th or 7th week on the job as the executive director, and I'm really the only staff person right now of our young organization. I actually come to this work after many years in the affordable housing world. I most recently worked for a number of nonprofit affordable housing developers in Massachusetts, in Boston, Somerville, and working around the region. And have had other roles in the affordable housing industry for the last probably 18, 19 years of my career, including as an organizer and advocate. So I'm excited to be in this role. I'm excited to be here today talking to you all. It just, very briefly about Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Our mission as an organization, is, I just have to remind myself, so we stand for abundant housing for all in communities across Massachusetts. We drive policy at the state and local level by identifying pro-housing change makers, building the power of local organizers, and connecting a statewide network. Our real vision is really, and our philosophy is really tied up in this concept of housing abundance. As Leo mentioned, we really believe that that every Massachusetts community should be open and welcoming to everyone, regardless of race, regardless of income. Those are certainly things we focus on, but it also includes life experience, people's age, or their ability. People should be able to live in the communities of their choice, regardless of any of these elements. And so every community needs to do more to actually create opportunities for housing. And so that's our mission. We sort of have a twofold focus in our work. One is to build up a grassroots network of pro-housing advocates in communities across the state. So there are local organizations that are part of our network that already exist in places like Newton or Cambridge or on the Cape and a couple other places. So trying to support their work through resources and staff capacity. Many of these are volunteer organizations without much resource or capacity. So trying to support those, and then trying to create new pro-housing, housing abundance focused organizations in communities and neighborhoods where they don't exist. And then secondarily, while building a statewide pro-housing movement, our goal is to help provide more voice to that movement in state level policy discussions. And so to that end, I'm doing a lot of work in my role as executive director, focusing on our statewide policy priorities. I'm a registered lobbyist in the state of Massachusetts. Generally things around zoning reform, allowing the creation of multifamily housing. I'm glad to see the ARC supports the accessory dwelling bill and has been a supporter of that. That's certainly something we support. Want to make accessory dwelling units more easier to build across the state of Massachusetts. So that's just us in a nutshell. I'm happy to get a little bit more into some of the policy stuff in more detail, but that's just by way of introduction, sort of who we are and who I am in a nutshell.
Great.
Thank
you, Jesse. I'm going to ask Chris to talk, and I guess in our parlance, what you were sharing about communities we call inclusion. So just
Absolutely.
Direct connect. So Chris, why don't you share a little bit, because this was your idea, reached out, you and Sheldon, who historically was at SIL. And see, now I know why I forgot your full name. See, because you want to go by SIL. So that makes sense. So Chris, why don't you start it off, and then Jesse, however you both want to do this.
Okay. Yeah, so the reason I thought it would be good to connect abundant housing with the ARC and with advocates and service providers more generally is that I really think just general the restrictions on housing across the board in Massachusetts, but also in Connecticut and a lot of other places in the country, really has an impact on housing for people with disabilities. And I thought there'd be a natural synergy between what you're advocating for, and wanted to encourage people to join the abundant housing cause in Massachusetts specifically. And I'll let Jesse talk more specifically about how abundant housing is doing that, but wanted to make kind of three general points about how it relates to housing for people with disabilities. And what I'm talking about here is mostly exclusionary zoning rules or zoning rules that don't allow really anything except for single family homes or very low density developments. And I'll make 3 points about that. One is that these rules just limit housing options. We're approached very often at CIL by families that are interested in creating, a different type of housing model, for their children, for example. They don't want their child to end up in, the typical group home setting. So they'll be interested in creating an intentional community, a pocket neighborhood, a small cluster of houses together that's integrated, or an integrated apartment building. And very often one of the first things, that I have to tell them is that, well, the location or the town you want to do that in does not allow that type of housing to be developed. And that's kind of, one of the things that forces like the replication of the group home model versus these other integrated models. So that's just number one. It limits the options of what's possible. Number two, more specifically, it limits housing options near transit and jobs, which is a huge deal for people with disabilities because very often they cannot drive. And it also creates issues for staffing because access for staff who often have trouble accessing a car. It does this in two ways. By one, just creating neighborhoods that are very car centric and require a car to get around, but also just limiting the ability to build housing near existing transit. In the Boston metro area in particular, we're pretty lucky to have a decent transportation network, but you often can't build a lot of housing near it. So for example, I was looking at a project in Acton, Massachusetts with a service provider and a family member who was interested in doing an integrated apartment building. We were looking at a specific property to acquire that was less than a quarter mile from the Acton train station, which goes directly to downtown Boston in about 30 minutes. The owner of that property had been working with the town for 4 years in order to get 7 units permitted on the site. So, and Acton's a relatively well-meaning town, but by only allowing 7 units that close to a transit stop and having it take so long to go through the development process, you're limiting really the number of people who can access that transit quite significantly. And you're also limiting the ability of that neighborhood to evolve in a way where people could actually live independently without a car. And then the final thing I'd just like to point out is that these restrictive zoning laws drive up the cost of everything. In April, the median home sale price for a house in Massachusetts was $756,000, which puts whole areas out of range for even relatively high income people, and is a major problem. But it particularly obviously impacts people with disabilities who tend to have very low incomes. And it also stretches the affordable housing dollars or the residential support dollars that are available very thin. So just this one more specific example, CIL is currently working with a service provider to see if there's a way we could develop a site that they are currently leasing from a private for-profit landlord in Newton. And the acquisition cost for that property is $800,000 just for the land. And that's a relative deal in Newton, but when you have to spend $800,000 for a quarter acre, you're really spreading public resources pretty thin in that case to provide housing for 4 to 5 individuals. Ideally with land that expensive, you'd be building duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, even large apartment buildings, where you could then find other ways to integrate people into the community. So those are just kind of 3 reasons I think this group should be particularly supportive of abundant housing. And I want to make one last point, actually. that the deinstitutionalization that CIL has been such a key part of over the last 40 years. You know, we've developed over 800 group homes in Connecticut and Massachusetts for people coming out of institutions. It would not have been possible without zoning overrides in both Connecticut and Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, it's the Dover Amendment. Allows us to build a group home essentially anywhere that a single family home is allowed. I promise you, we would not have been able to develop nearly as many homes as we have without that override. You know, most of our homes meet little to no resistance, but enough meet strong resistance that it would have had a real significant effect on housing options. So I think that's just another reason people should keep in mind as we look to other models and other types of housing. It needs to be allowed first and foremost at the local level.
Yeah, so historically, the Dover Amendment was a huge deal for us in early cases, especially when people were like, oh, they didn't want a home in the neighborhood. And then for those of you, Bob Persky, I was going to say Robert, he had a book called New Life in the Neighborhoods. So today we're seeing a shift, not only for people with intellectual developmental disabilities, for a long time, people cross disability, right, have wanted more individualized housing and found affordable, accessible housing a barrier, which is why I think it was 18 years ago, CHAPA got a grant to try to start cataloging what's available. It was so bad. So let's go further, because this is something really important to us, because more and more people were seeing that self-direction, people did better, you know, when they lived in smaller, like 1 or 2 person situations, right? They did better with the COVID virus as well. And let alone, but then we can intersect too with other communities. So Jesse, do you want to share a little bit more about some of the issues you see? Because the cost of housing have been bad for 20 years, right? And just gets worse every year.
Worse, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, I should take Chris on the road with me, because he does such a good job of detailing what the challenges are in Massachusetts, and why it's so hard to build, you know, all types of housing in communities throughout the state. And certainly the costs have been bad for a while, but it's getting worse and worse, and there's so many reasons for that. And part of the reason is that there's just not enough housing, and so there's so much demand for the housing that exists. You know, in 2014, so it's now a few years ago, but the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, which covers, you know, the greater Boston region, did actually a statewide study and regional study of housing demand in Massachusetts. And they realized by 2030, there was demand for about 500,000 new homes in Massachusetts, for a variety of reasons, because of people moving to the state, because of, you know, seniors downsizing, because of growing families, for a variety of reasons. 500,000 new homes across the state, 430,000 of them centered in greater Boston. Again, that's 430,000 new homes that we would need by 2030 in greater Boston, and the vast majority of them, about 2/3, because of, you know, changing preferences, and this is all pre-COVID, changing preferences, about 2/3 of them were for multifamily housing, not the traditional single-family home. Now, we may have seen some changes because of impacts of the pandemic, but you know, that remains to be seen. And then, so even though there was this demand for 430,000 new homes in Massachusetts, and this is across the spectrum, this is market rate housing, this is affordable housing, this is assisted housing, this is, you know, all types of housing, based on permitting in the last few years, again, prior to the pandemic, you know, we were on target in greater Boston to fall about 100 or 150,000 units short of that demand. So, you know, the overarching problem that we see it is that we have great demand for housing, as I've already laid out, and what happens when you have such great demand but relatively limited stock or supply of housing is that those people with the resources are the most competitive for the housing. So you know, you see cranes above Boston and Cambridge and other places. And so it feels like there's a lot of housing getting built over the last few years, even during the pandemic. But the reality is we're not keeping up with what we need. And that means that those higher income folks with the resources are outbidding lower income folks for the sort of limited stock of housing that exists, or the limited supply of new housing that's been built in the last 10 years or so. And so that's going to cause problems generally for people of lower income, certainly people with disabilities, seniors as they're trying to downsize, running up in competition for housing with folks drawn to, let's say, the greater Boston area to work in the biotech industry who have higher incomes, things like that. So, our focus is on inclusion. It's on making sure that every community in greater Boston and across the state does its share to meet our housing demand and provide homes for families and individuals of all walks of life. And so we're trying to focus both on sort of the local level, local zoning, as well as how the state laws can help facilitate new housing production in communities across the state. So one of the things we're talking with some of our organizations, and some of our members have already done this successfully, is the concept of an affordable housing overlay. This is something that Cambridge and Somerville have both passed relatively recently, and there's an effort underway that we're pushing in Boston, essentially giving developers of affordable housing, and a developer like CIL would be included, essentially greater allowance under local zoning in terms of the density of housing that they can build, even greater than what a market rate developer might be able to build on the same plot of land. So this is really helpful, particularly in those really, really hot real estate markets like Cambridge, where the local nonprofit affordable housing developers are outcompeted constantly for land because the cost of acquiring land and buildings is so expensive, they can't justify it for the limited number of homes they may be able to build under the base zoning. An affordable housing overlay allows them to build more than a market rate developer would be able to build, and therefore spread the cost of housing of acquiring that land among more units. And so it makes those developer pro formas, their budgets, work a little bit better. It helps keep them under the per unit development cost that the State Department of Housing Community Development applies. And so again, Cambridge and Somerville have recently adopted them, and I hope Boston and other communities will too. So that's just one example on the local level that we're looking at, particularly in the affordable housing space. On the federal, or rather on the state level, one of the things that we've been really excited about was that in the last economic development bill in January, the legislature included a provision, and the governor signed it, that would require every community that has MBTA service, trains, buses, ferries, things like that, to have at least one district where multifamily housing is allowed by local zoning as of right within half-mile of transit. And so, that will help spread the new housing creation across the region. And, to the point Chris was making, particularly around not just people with disabilities, but all people want better access to transit. And we want to try to get people out of cars as much as possible for sustainability reasons, focus a lot of that new housing around existing transit. And then communities that don't comply with that won't be eligible for certain state infrastructure funds. So it's a real policy lever to get suburbs, in particular, to create more housing. One thing that I'll say, going back to my earlier statement around housing production that we have seen in Massachusetts and in greater Boston, although it does feel like there's a lot of cranes over the sky, like downtown Boston, parts of Cambridge, maybe Somerville to some degree, and a couple other communities, the vast majority of new housing production in Massachusetts, the entire state, has been focused in 5 communities. It's Boston, Cambridge, Somerville. Actually, Somerville's not included because they don't report the right data. They're probably in there, but it's Boston, Cambridge, Everett, Watertown, and Chelsea. Those 5 communities have had the vast majority of new housing that's been produced in the entire state over the last few years. So again, requiring the suburbs to do more in terms of building housing near transit will help that. Sorry, I'm hearing some feedback, so getting distracted there. But those are some of the policy focuses we have I saw there a few chats came up, so
Yeah,
I don't
Jeff,
know
before
how you
we
want
hit-
to do that,
Yeah,
Leo.
we have a raised hand and a few chats, but before we do that, one of the things that struck me, that wasn't there like a smart growth, this might be before your time, that it might have even been Mitt Romney put ahead. And so we have like
Yeah.
a Newton development by the train, right by the MBTA, and we have a Westwood one that I know of off the top of my head. Was that short-lived, and were those affordable as well? Those units, or were they just smart growth units? Do you know offhand?
Well, so there is the state chapter 40R, which essentially creates, allows communities to create these smart growth zoning districts, and then it gets them eligibility for certain funding as well. And I can't remember if that was under Romney or Patrick, but yes, it's been around for a while now. Some communities have adopted it, but it's been a very voluntary program, and so the impact
That's the
hasn't been
problem. Yeah.
quite as widespread as we had hoped. It's allows communities to opt in, and again, some have. And I can't remember offhand. Sorry, Leo. Particularly around affordability, I know that it's not 100% affordability, or that 100% of the units need to be affordable. I think there may be a requirement that a certain percentage, maybe 10% of them or 15% of them, similar to 40B, may have to be affordable, or there may be some greater incentives. I can't recall offhand. I apologize, but it's not explicitly an affordability tool. It's more of a smart growth tool.
Yeah, good point. And somebody asked about Lowell. Elaine asked about housing in non-Boston suburbs such as Lowell, and and Liz Fancher noted that Arlington just passed a rule on accessory housing that's required, that's pretty exciting. I didn't even know about that.
Arlington and Brookline also, actually. Brookline Town Meeting, I think just last week passed it. So both in the last month, Arlington and Brookline have passed ADU legislation. I don't know a lot about the Brookline one yet. I've actually, I'm on the Cape, because I've been mostly on vacation the last week, so I haven't had a chance to look into the Brookline one. But the Arlington one is very good because it allows accessory dwelling units by right across the city. And so that's great, rather than having to get a special permit or a variance in order to do an accessory dwelling unit. If you have the right size lot, you can build an ADU by right. The question about Lowell, I'll have to take a look at to see specifically what the question was. Non-Boston suburb near Lowell. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Elaine, I'm happy to address anything in particular you might have. But sorry, I think my camera went out. I apologize for that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say generally, our focus is on getting every community to do more. My understanding experience has been that in sort of the non-Boston areas, so like Lowell and then the suburbs around Lowell, a lot of housing that has been produced in those areas have been in the cities and in places like Lowell, and that the suburbs around it haven't done as much. And so we're trying to spread some of that out, because we can't expect any one or handful of communities to do the bulk of the work, because you hit up against the limits of what local regulators can handle, or local zoning boards, things like that. So we absolutely want every community, including suburbs, to do more. And one of the reasons for getting suburbs to do more is that they often have some of the better school systems, and we absolutely want to invest in urban school systems and make them better for the families and young people that live there. But often the suburbs, right now have great suburbs, and so I don't know as much around the suburbs around Lowell, but certainly thinking about Boston and Newton, for instance, want to open up more opportunities for families to live in Newton. I know that families isn't necessarily the focus of this group, but that's one of the ways we think about suburbs versus cities. I don't know, Elaine, though, if you have a specific question about the Lowell area that I can address. Happy to do it.
The other thing, Rhoda had her hand. Oh, go ahead, Chris. You want to comment?
Just to say about the Lowell area, we do a fair amount of development in the suburbs around Lowell, and kind of northeast Massachusetts in general. And you really do feel the impacts of, they're still part of the Boston metro area in terms of, the real estate market. So you've noticed this significant price difference even there versus like Western Massachusetts, say. So it is part of the same general phenomenon. People that, move out, to get, it's kind of drive to qualify. They go as far out as you can to qualify for the mortgage. And it goes quite far out in Boston, given how expensive it is in the inner ring.
Thank you, Chris. Rhoda had her hand up early in the program. Rhoda, is there a question you want to ask? Or
Yes, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I am the coordinator for, I'm actually a head person for the Adapt Housing Work Group. And I'm not sure if you guys are aware that Senator Warren just introduced a bill that's gotten quite a housing bill, April 22nd. And in that bill, we were able to get 10% accessible and 4% sensory added into her bill, that all units being remodeled or newly built has to have 10% of the building accessible and 4% sensory. And we're also working with the White House and Representative Maxine Waters for the infrastructure housing bills and trying to get more accessibility language in that. I would like to talk further with Chris and Jesse offline on how their organization can help and be a part of the things that ADAPT is trying to do. I know the ARC knows about ADAPT and
Sure
the
do,
different
Rhoda.
things.
Thank you for, yes, and we'll hook you up, Rhoda. Do you want to type in your email? And
Okay.
we'll connect you to Jesse, and ADAPT's a great organization and done some great work nationally. And we also have Commissioner Kristen McCosh here, Boston's commissioner,
Right.
is on as well, and a couple other names I recognize that are colleagues. So, so thank you, Rhoda. Yeah, if you want to pop it in or send it, however you want to do it, we'll connect the dots.
Send it to Carrie directly?
Yeah, you can type it into
Okay.
the message box, or you can send it to Kerry's last name's easier than mine, Mahoney at arcmass.org, but you can also pop it into chat, and we'll follow up and connect the.
Well, I am just putting it into the chat to Carrie directly. to
Thank
Carrie.
you. Thank you, Rhoda.
All right.
Um,
And because I wanted to find out, working together, but also for all of the disability community. And we're working as ADAPT works for all disabilities, and not just one or two. So we're hopefully getting more, we're at the talking stage, and Maxine Waters' staff, we're waiting for the White House to do an update on the draft bill so far. And then once we get it, we'll be able to pass it on. But also too, are you aware about the Eleanor Smith IDA Act? It wasn't passed when it was introduced in 2019, but she's gonna, James Kwiatkowski from Chicago, she will be doing, actually introducing it around the anniversary of the ADA, July 26th. We just had a call with her last week on Friday. So I would like to talk more with Chris and Jesse on this, and how we can work together in getting housings built, not only in Massachusetts, but I'm looking at it on a national level. But I am the co-founder of MassAdapt, so.
Great. I'd love to connect with you, Rhoda. That
Yes.
sounds great.
I sent it to Carrie in the my email.
Great.
So I look forward to speaking with you.
Great. This is a huge area, we're talking about, right? It's One of the questions, and I know we're nearing the end of the 45 minutes, but I want to throw at you, Jesse, and Chris, you might want to comment on it too, is, what about policemen, firemen, teachers? Why haven't we been able, you would have thought, right? And I can tell you, I had a conversation with a key office holder 15 years ago about housing, right? And they were annoyed with us asking for so much money for staff in our field. And I said, well, we wouldn't be asking for so much if housing wasn't so out of control in healthcare. And he said, oh, you want to solve the big ones. And I'm not going to say who it was because the person is actually a big office holder today. But it was just the point that no one wants to touch the housing issue, the real estate issue, right? And some of that's even wealth investment, right? We have a lot of people from other countries investing, or from Massachusetts, right? Third, fourth homes to rent to people. And that drives the price up too. So why do you think people like the middle class, don't really fight this thing when they're the ones just as affected as, lower income folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I don't know, people, I don't know the right answer, but I will say that I've seen some change in the last couple of years. I think that as even like middle class folks, maybe of the baby boomer generation who were able to, buy their home 30 years ago and raise their kids in whatever community, are now seeing that their kids, even if they graduate from college and have professional jobs, can't afford to live in the same community and buy a home where they grew up. And so that's one thing that's starting to change people's thinking to some degree, and get more folks involved in at least thinking about the housing crisis and how their own local rules and regulations impact it. I'll also say that, in the last couple years, and in particular the last year, since the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis and the sort of racial reckoning around that, and particularly progressive white people starting to think about some of their why their communities, and we have a lot of communities of greater Boston around Massachusetts that are 95% white, why their communities look the way they do, and start thinking, well, maybe the way we regulate what can be built here directly impacts who can live here. And again, I'm of course talking in this case about sort of racial diversity, but it also certainly impacts age diversity, and diversity of ability, and just ability of these communities to be inclusive. So I don't know why it's been an issue that people haven't historically thought a lot about, but I think it's starting to change. I've seen more people, and I've been doing more talks like this to various organizations that are concerned with housing affordability for various populations and at various levels. And so I'm hopeful, at least, that the tide is starting to change. And now, some 52 years or so after Chapter 40B passed in Massachusetts, maybe we can do something else pretty big and even more impactful, because, of course, 40B being 50 plus years ago, we still have the vast majority of Massachusetts that isn't affordable to everyone. So I don't know. That's how I would respond, that I'm hopeful things are changing.
No, I appreciate it. Chris, you want to add to that, or you feel you don't have to? But
yeah, just I would say that, in the 20 years that I've been following and been involved in real estate and housing issues, I think there are more people, like Jesse and I, in their, 30s, like kind of older millennials, I guess, who are looking at this and saying, like, I make good money, why can't I afford a house? So that's why you are seeing groups like Abundant Housing getting more support. I'd also point out that part of the problem, particularly in Massachusetts, is just when you don't allow people to live in a community, the people who have been able to live there are very invested in housing prices going up in many cases, because it directly benefits them. And you don't see the person who's moved to Tampa or to Atlanta or something because they just cannot afford to live in Massachusetts. And that's a big problem, just for the future, economy of the state.
And keeping the state vital, right, Chris? Yeah.
Because like, you know, where a lot of my relatives live in northern Florida outside of Jacksonville. And there are, you know, many houses built by for-profit developers that cost $100,000 to $200,000. And the property taxes down there are, you know, a couple grand a year would be high. And so you can reach pretty far down the income, you know, ladder with housing costs that low. And it's the regulations that don't allow that to happen here.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of last minute things. Giassi noted that Bedford just approved detached ADUs and an assisted living overlay district. So that's awesome. We're going to look all that up offline so we can promote that. I think that might be this week's Notes from the Arc, my blog. Or Notes from the Arc will be on this topic. We covered it a few weeks ago, and it might be why we've got a more diverse audience today. And I just also want to say, Alice mentioned that zoning, it's not a boring subject, which is true, right? You brought it to life for us. I want to thank you for that, and I look forward to working with both of you, but especially working with Jesse in Massachusetts. And it sounds like ADAPT is looking to that too, which means the ILs, the other CILs will be interested. And just, it's always, we've had a decades-long relationship with SIL. Just want to, you know, nod to you guys. I know Sheldon was on as well, who we worked with many decades ago. So thank you for being on today, Jesse. Good work. Congratulations on being the first executive director of Abundant Housing. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I don't feel stupid about not knowing about you before, so that's helpful to know.
Brand new.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. And Chris, great seeing you again. And everybody, thank you for being here. Next week, you'll have to wait to see who my guest is next week. It's I'll blame it on Memorial Day and COVID, but I won't be able to use that excuse soon. But it's great having you all with us, and have a great week, and see you guys next week. Take care.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.